Imagine waking up in the middle of winter, in a world without electricity, without central heating, and without supermarkets. The air inside your home is so cold that your breath turns into mist. Your hands feel numb. The fire from last night has almost gone out. Outside, the land is buried under snow. The fields that once fed your family are frozen solid. Now imagine knowing that the next few months could decide whether your family survives or not. For people living in the Middle Ages, winter was not simply a season. It was a yearly struggle for survival. Between the 10th and 15th centuries, millions of people across Europe faced winters that were long, dark, and brutally cold. There were no weather forecasts to warn about storms, no modern medicine to treat illness, no reliable way to bring food from far away. If the harvest had been poor, winter could quickly turn into famine. If the cold lasted too long, livestock could die. And if food supplies ran out, entire villages could face starvation. Yet somehow, medieval communities survived. Year after year, generation after generation, people learned how to endure the harshest months of the year. They prepared carefully, they relied on their neighbors, and they developed practical strategies to fight against the cold, because in the Middle Ages, surviving winter was never guaranteed. It was something that had to be earned every single year. Surviving a medieval winter depended on three essential things: clothing, heat, and food. Without any one of them, life during winter could quickly become dangerous. Clothing was the first line of defense. Thick wool garments and heavy cloaks helped trap warmth and protect the body from freezing winds. But even the warmest clothing could not stop the cold completely. That is why fire was just as important. Inside every home, the hearth burned almost constantly during winter. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook meals. Families gathered close to the fire because only a small area of the house could stay warm. The third element of survival was food. Winter meant that fields were frozen and fresh crops were impossible to grow. Everything people ate during these months depended on what had been prepared and preserved earlier in the year. Grain was stored carefully in granaries. Meat and fish were salted or smoked so they could last for months. Dried fruits, fermented vegetables, and barrels of ale helped families survive the long, cold season. These three elements, clothing, fire, and food, formed a delicate balance that allowed medieval communities to endure winter. If one failed, survival became uncertain. And that is why preparing for winter was one of the most important tasks in medieval life. The first and most visible defense against winter in the Middle Ages was clothing. Unlike modern fashion, medieval clothing was designed mainly for survival. People needed garments that could keep them warm during long days of freezing temperatures. The most important material was wool. Wool fibers trap small pockets of air, creating natural insulation that helps retain body heat. Even when damp, wool can still keep a person warm, which made it ideal for cold climates. For this reason, wool became the foundation of winter clothing across much of medieval Europe. People rarely wore just one layer of clothing. Instead, they dressed in multiple layers to trap warmth. A linen shirt was usually worn closest to the skin. It absorbed sweat and protected the body. Over this came heavier wool garments such as tunics, gowns, or cloaks. These layers created pockets of warm air that helped protect the body from the cold. While the clothing was heavy and sometimes uncomfortable, it was essential for survival during the long winter months. During the Middle Ages, people understood that a single piece of clothing was not enough to protect against the cold. Instead, they relied on a system of layers. Layered clothing helped trap warm air between fabrics, creating natural insulation that protected the body from freezing temperatures. The first layer was usually made of linen and worn directly against the skin. Linen absorbed sweat and kept the body dry, which was important because moisture could make the cold even more dangerous. Over the linen layer, people wore thicker wool garments such as tunics or gowns. Finally, an outer cloak provided protection from wind and snow. These layers worked together to keep warmth close to the body. Although the clothing could be heavy and sometimes uncomfortable, it allowed people to work outdoors, travel between villages, and continue daily life even during the harsh winter months. For medieval people, layered clothing was not just practical, it was a key strategy for survival. While wool provided warmth, it was not always enough to protect people from the harshest winter conditions. That is why animal fur played such an important role in medieval clothing. Fur added another powerful layer of insulation against cold winds and freezing temperatures. Many different types of animal skins were used, including rabbit, fox, squirrel, and sheepskin. Contrary to popular belief, fur was not worn only by nobles or wealthy people. Many rural families used animal skins from their own livestock or from animals they hunted. One of the most practical winter garments was the sheepskin coat. When worn with the wool side facing inward, it created a thick layer of insulation that helped retain body heat. These coats were bulky and heavy, but they allowed farmers, shepherds, and travelers to work outdoors for long periods of time during winter. For many people living in the Middle Ages, fur clothing was not a luxury. It was a necessity for survival. Even the warmest clothing could not fully protect people from the freezing cold of winter. That is why the fire inside the home was essential for survival. In most medieval houses, the center of daily life was the hearth. The hearth was more than just a fireplace. It was the main source of warmth, light, and cooking. In many small cottages, the fire burned in the middle of the room. Smoke slowly drifted upward and escaped through a hole in the roof. These homes were often filled with smoke, making the air difficult to breathe. But despite the discomfort, the fire was necessary. Without it, the cold winter air would quickly make the house unlivable. Families gathered close to the hearth during the evening, sharing warmth and preparing meals. In wealthier homes, fireplaces built into stone walls with chimneys helped guide smoke outside. But even these fireplaces were not very efficient. Most of the house remained cold, and warmth stayed only near the fire. For medieval families, the hearth was not simply part of the house. It was the center of survival during the long winter months. Keeping a fire burning throughout winter required one critical resource: fuel. For medieval families, firewood was one of the most valuable supplies during the cold season. Without enough fuel, even the warmest clothing and strongest homes could not protect people from freezing temperatures. Most households depended on wood gathered from nearby forests. Families spent months collecting and storing firewood before winter arrived. Large piles of wood were stacked outside cottages or stored in sheds to keep them dry. But gathering firewood was not always easy. In many regions, forests were owned by nobles or landlords, and strict laws controlled who was allowed to cut wood. People who collected wood illegally could face serious punishment. When firewood was scarce, communities had to rely on other types of fuel. In some areas, people burned peat, blocks of dried plant material cut from wetlands. Others used dried animal dung or agricultural waste such as straw. None of these fuels burned as well as wood, but they helped families keep their fires alive. Because in the Middle Ages, running out of fuel during winter could be a matter of life and death. Warm clothing and fire could protect people from the cold, but surviving winter also depended on food. During winter, fields were frozen and fresh crops were impossible to grow. Families relied on food that had been preserved months earlier. Meat and fish were often salted or smoked so they could last for long periods. Fruits such as apples and pears were dried, while vegetables like cabbage were fermented. Grain was carefully stored in granaries and used to bake bread throughout the winter. These preservation methods allowed medieval families to survive until the next harvest arrived. For people living in the Middle Ages, winter was a challenge that returned every year. Clothing protected their bodies from freezing winds. Fire brought warmth to cold homes, and preserved food carried families through the long, dark months. None of these solutions were perfect, but together they allowed medieval communities to survive. Each winter that passed was more than just another season. It was proof that preparation, cooperation, and resilience could overcome even the harshest cold.